Good afternoon. Welcome to the Living Well with Dr. Bell, Heart of the Matter. Today, that's our topic, the heart of the matter. And I am pleased to introduce to you Dr. Thaddeus John Bell, physician and founder of Closing the Gap in Healthcare. And today we are joined by a special guest, Dr. Tom Gordon. He is a therapist. He is a native of Columbia, South Carolina, and has done extensive work, not only here in South Carolina, but in all parts of the country. And we are pleased to have him on to talk with us today about a very heavy subject, and that is the number of suicides that we have been seeing in the last week to 2 weeks, both celebrity and non celebrity. Dr. Gordon and Dr. Bell, welcome.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you very
Uh,
much.
We're
like to
going to
say
dive
hello.
right in. Dr. Gordon, talk to us and tell us what we need to know about the signs and symptoms, and even in some instances with our loved ones, there are no signs and there are no symptoms. What is it that you would give us as far as advice, given the current state of suicide in America?
Yeah, our real health personally is tied to our health collectively. So I would start by saying we must invest deeper in creating conversational space. We're hustle bustle, grab and go, eat, on the run, moving fast. And if you're going to actually maintain your own health, we've got to practice connection, and conversational space allows us to deepen those connections, just like sometimes faith based community space allows us to deepen connections. Um, we are really disconnected on
Yeah.
every level. And so, what happens with a human being is our choices are, are derivative or spring forth or downstream from our thinking, and you can't have a human being alive without a human being thinking. And the
Right.
problem is those thoughts, which might be 50,000 to 70,000 thoughts a day, some of them are confused and full of despair and full of misinformation and distorted. So you have now two demons, the demon of disconnect and the demon of distortion. I'm going to talk about that a lot because we can't really solve this problem if we don't address the disconnect and we don't begin to introduce more information to people that they are great, they are worthy, they are inherently valuable. And so what happens is people make choices that sort of demonstrate their thinking, and often those choices are risky, impulsive, and represent people having broken hearts and broken dreams and no hope and trapped in what I'll call karma. Old folks used to say what goes around comes around. That's this notion of karma. You're trapped in it because you don't see a way out of the trap. Then your mind starts thinking you're trapped forever. Whereas if we're really connected, then the game isn't over as long as you actually have someone to support and talk to and be in conversation with about how do you get up, fall 7 times, but get up 8 and actually learn from the 7 so you're better off in terms of not stumbling. So my opening is we got to fight some disconnects and distortions at every level, and we got to create more conversational space because we have people bragging about my folks beat me half to death and I'm okay, and you got people preaching in pulpits about spare the rod, spoil the child. Well, you beat people, you beat their voice down, and you also begin to set up reactions to that disempowerment. So there's a lot of particulars that flow off of that, but the general theme is we've got to guide people to have better choices. And to do that, we got to connect with them because they
Hmm.
don't care how much you know. If they don't know how much you care, this
Yeah.
has implications for the cultural compatibility of the providers and people that are working with the folks that are troubled, because we don't have as far to go in terms of the connections that some other people well intended might have. because culturally we are disconnected long before that person shows up with symptoms.
I agree.
Well,
Okay. Dr.
well,
Bell, one of the things that we talked about earlier on, a few segments ago, is the social isolation among our 50 plus population, particularly since COVID 19. And Dr. Bell, I know you've spoken to that before, but can you just reiterate the importance of the connectivity with the 50 plus population?
right. One of the things that we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we discussed this, we talked about loneliness and how loneliness is a major part of what the people that are in AARP are currently experiencing. A lot of this loneliness happens as a result of COVID because of the mere fact that folk have to now stay in, they're disconnected, they can't be connected to their families. I'll give you a perfect example of how loneliness can sometimes present itself differently from the way that we ordinarily think that it presents. I saw a lady who came in complaining to me that her blood sugar was out of control. And she wanted me to make some changes in her medications. And so when I started talking to her about how she was doing since her husband passed away from COVID, she immediately began to tell me, well, I'm not eating like I used to eat. I'm not as hungry. The food doesn't taste as good. I'm lonely. I'm in my home by myself. So the bottom issue was not so much that her diabetes was out of control, which it was, but the underlying issue, Tom, was that she did not have the connectivity that you talked about. She did not have anybody to talk about or talk with, and etc. And then things that made it even worse because of COVID, she couldn't be joined by her family and her friends during the time that she was grieving. So, Joe, I think that kind of answers your question.
It
One,
does.
one of the things that I would like to ask Dr. Gordon uh, to address, I was just on a webinar this morning, and the question that kept coming up is, how could we have, what were the signs or symptoms that the patient that these young people that we've been hearing about, what were the signs and symptoms that we should have looked for, that we should have picked up on, or were there any?
Yeah, we know some of the signs and symptoms, and Joe can weigh in on this as well because they vary a little bit between guys and gals. They vary in terms of presentation. We have a culture that actually trains guys that goodness is being hard and holding in and not being vulnerable and expressing emotion. So women have a cultural advantage as girls. It's more permission for them to express their emotions than guys. But just to answer your question, if somebody is successful in the act, we can't learn from that person. But I have been fortunate not only to think and study about this, but I've actually had people that I'm working with who are giving me some of the signs. And therefore I can answer your question based on, that kind of thinking that's in the field. So there are some signs. And if we go over just a few, it might help somebody pay more attention. And that's what I meant by get to know your people, connect with them, because then you'll have a reference foundation for the first warning sign. And
Mhm.
Dr. Bell just mentioned it. When someone, because you actually looked them in the eye and said it showed them that you care, open up a little bit more about what was going on. So he basically, Dr. Bell set up conversational space as opposed to treating the patient like a commodity and I'm going to move the room and get 100 people through here. He's saying, no, a person is in front of me. and I'm going to connect with the person and look at the information that comes out. It's about root cause. So one of the signs that you look for is a, you operate off of referencing some behavior to a habit or a pattern that the person has set up. Oh yeah, I used to eat, but now the food doesn't taste good. I don't enjoy my food. You know, there's a pattern, and now it's a deviation or a drift off of the pattern that's been established. Sometimes this drift shows up, it was just what Dr. Bell said, which is people seem to be showing you that what was important and valuable and interesting before is now becoming less important. So they're beginning to show you signs of disengagement from their normal. So let's call that habits,
Mm-hmm.
because that means everybody's got certain patterns. And some people have different rhythms for getting up early versus when they go to bed. Others have different food preferences, as Dr. Bell mentioned. People are interested sometimes in extracurricular contact with other people. So watch out for a drift. It doesn't have to be a total uh, attempt to kill themselves, but a drift from an established pattern in the way people talk. Okay, how they what they talk about, the amount of talking. If somebody's used to being engaged at the table and now they're not, then that begin to show you something. And any kind of drift from that pattern, you pay attention to. Here's an
Mm-hmm.
example when people have things that's very valuable to them. They will start drifting and sometimes give away things that are very valuable to them because on their mind is life isn't worth living, and I'm going to actually give somebody else something that maybe they can get some benefit from. So now somebody gives you their watch, or something very special to them. That's a drift off of a pattern if you know that that's something they really really cared about.
Mm-hmm.
So watch out
Dr.
for disconnects where they're isolating themselves. Watch out for drifts off of a habit, okay? And watch out for distorted thinking that depresses their worth. So that somebody starts saying, I'm no good at. A lot of times, and Joe, you may want to chime into this because men and women, human beings are always looking at their bodies
Mm-hmm.
as we interact in the world. So we're looking at the world interacting, but we're also looking at ourselves. So you can get people ashamed of their vulnerability or their bodies, and you can get them hiding out in bulimia or uh, anorexia or attempts to hurt themselves.
Or just hiding out, period.
Now,
Because,
hiding out, period.
one of the things, Dr. Gordon, that I think we need to just touch on is the fact of how social media plays a role in this distortion. People appear happy, they appear to be on top of the world, when in all actuality, it is an appearance.
And I love your phrase, and we need to make it mandatory that people who are being providers get some cultural competency training because the way we hide out, the way we laugh, the way we cry is different culturally. And you'll miss out on the facade and the pretense that people are doing because what they're doing with that is they are using a distraction as a solution. If they can keep you at a distance, then they distract you from how much pain they're in. And frankly, after you're not a little child anymore, this is the reason you can't stop suicide because people will pick hiding as a solution as
And
opposed
it's
to
so funny that
connecting
you
with you.
Right. It's funny that you say that because one of the things that I noticed, particularly with, I've got three young adults, and oftentimes I have to pull information out of them. So I am very intentional about what they say. So I'm constantly actively listening to what they're saying, but I'm also listening for what they're not saying.
Exactly. Because, and your point here is all behavior is communications.
Hmm.
It doesn't stop by you only paying attention to what somebody said. That's typically about 10%. That's the iceberg tip. The real ice is what they don't say or the tonality that they use, because people give you signals sometimes by what they don't say, or what they don't elaborate. Now, one
Mhm.
helpful tip is don't ask people closed ended questions
That's right.
that they can say, okay. You always ask people, what has been a highlight of your week?
Hmm.
What's been really tough? How's it going? And what's been interesting about it? You always asking what, how, because people can't shake their head and say, you say, is today a good day? Then they can pretend and hide out.
Right.
Yeah.
You
And
say,
so
well,
one
yeah,
one of the things that one of the questions that came up from the young people this morning, they didn't understand how people who seem to have it all together, like the young woman, beautiful, an attorney, had a good job, seemed to be on a trajectory up. The young man, Regina King's son, handsome young man, um, was in fact on tour, uh, and getting ready to do some very interesting things. Yet still, they took their own life.
right.
Can you make a few comments? Is that kind of typical?
Yes, because again, in your medical work, Dr. Bell, there would be some signs that you could pay attention to if you had access to the patient. So, Joe is saying, well, I pay a lot of attention to active listening because I'm trying to get some sense of what's going on because she's got access to her children. But a lot of times, in people don't, one, are not alert to the signs, and they don't have access to what's really going on for people because folks have created a life within a life within a life, and some of it's pretense. As Chris Rock used to say, we get a habit of sending out our best representatives, not our authentic self. So
Right.
now you're sending out your representatives, and now people reacting to the image that you've created as you hide out. Then they're surprised on Thursday that you're no longer here because your attempt was successful. A lot of times, people's attempts are not successful. So then you have a deeper sign. And I guess the youngest patient I've seen was 9 years old. Now, why would a 9-year old feel so despondent? And we're all great and gifted. So this kid is gifted. He's not brain damaged. He's a gifted child, and he's on the surface, you would say, all appearances, it's just like Regina King's son. All appearances. Well, no, that's why the story about Jesus, is very relevant because Jesus is actually showing people that what you think is going on, there's something else going on. Okay. And you just thought I died. And then 3 days later, I show up again. So appearances are tricky. And in medicine, that's why we do x-rays, MRIs, etc. We're trying to get underneath the surface, right? So what happens is people start hiding. Now, it turns out if you create space to connect, even as young as 9 years old, and I work with people that are hardened murderers, armed robbery, because sometimes depression shows up with aggression. And before somebody tries to kill themselves, they'll hurt somebody else. So I'm looking for the signs of hostility, not just depression. But I've had 9-year olds up to uh, really, really grown folks in their 50s cry like babies in my arm. Why? Because I made the connection to find out that that was hiding, and that what was really going on at home is I am trapped because when I go home, I'm getting sexually assaulted by the foster parent guardian that's getting money from the state to take care of me, and I'm getting, assaulted. Or uh, a sign very dramatic is young 14-year-old cuts her wrists. Okay, so now somebody's actively trying to kill themselves. But that intent didn't just happen there, just like diabetes symptoms show up. But something's been going off kilter, off balance for 10 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
we're about
so you,
halfway through the segment, so I want to remind our viewers that if you have a question, and you would like that question responded to, please put that in our chat function. And Dr. Bell or Dr. Gordon will respond to your question. I also want to share with you the National Prevention
Suicide prevention hotline.
Suicide Prevention Lifeline.
Yep.
That number is 800 1-800 273 8255. That's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Is 1-800 273 8255. Dr.
Um,
Gordon, there's so much that we need to unpack here. Thank you so much for being with us today to do this. It may require you coming back.
No
And
problem.
Dr.
No
Bell,
problem.
we are constantly looking at issues of health disparities and how health disparities and other related topics impact um, the 50 plus here in South Carolina. This is an extension of the work that we're doing because it all relates to the heart. And we've got grandparents who are taking care of their grandchildren,
Like
or
never
they have
before. Yep.
their neighbors.
Yep.
It is not an isolated occurrence where we can separate it from the other types of issues that we are dealing with. And I will say that part of me feels like we need to have a real conversation around normalizing mental health and mental health treatment, because in the African American community, mental health and seeking counseling is not always seen as a positive. But when it comes to our mental health, particularly with some of the issues that we're dealing with today, and not only African Americans, but anyone can benefit from mental health services and getting the care that they need. And so I think we have to be a proponent for receiving the care that you need. It all is connected. So,
yeah,
Dr. Gordon and Dr. Bell, can you just talk a bit about normalizing mental health and the services for all people?
well, I'll start off and I'll be brief. One of the things that um, people should know is that primary care physicians, family physicians like myself, we are trained to deal with mental health problems. Um, Depression is probably the most common mental health problem that we see. We are trained to deal with that. But here's the issue and the barrier. Oftentimes, the system is set up in such a way that it does not allow us to give recognition to the issue. Because you can't talk to somebody in 5 minutes and then usher them out of the office. Okay? And sometimes you may have to come back to see your primary care physician, and you may have to let them know you're coming in because of loneliness, because of depression, and etc. Now, lots of times it may take so much time and it may take other expertise. And that's when I feel very comfortable referring the patient to someone like Dr. Gordon.
Hmm. Thank you, Dr. Bell.
Yeah.
Dr. Gordon.
Yeah, the thing I would add to it is that the toxicity and dysfunction is greater than the resources that we have to match it. And if we look at the importance of people staying hiding out, mistrusting the connection with the provider because we don't have black and brown providers at the level that we have problems with black and brown people, then you're going to have people intimidated by normal healthcare settings. And what happens is people don't get welcome and connection. They get a provider that looks at their computer and checks the meds, and they don't really establish that connection like you might get if we were actually trained providers to be culturally competent and increase the number of black and brown providers, which means you'd have to deal with the feeder pools and schools and what they're accepting and admitting. So I mentioned personal choices and habits earlier. I want to
Mm-hmm.
introduce another H word, which is habitat, history and habitat. A lot of people are going to show you symptoms personally that you can't solve at the level of the person. And a good example of this is think back about 7 years ago when they told us, and you know it was going on long before 7 years ago, but they told us 7 years ago the water in Flint, Michigan is full of lead and poison. And as we have this talk today, we haven't seen a systemic rallying to actually address that every day you drink lead and mercury and poison and you know you're doing it, that you're destroying the ability of persons to have great lives. So the other elephant in the room is you have a system that's actually set up to make people commodities and to have a whole bunch of people in poverty or struggling or not politically connected with representatives that will fight for their justice and fight for their having a decent chance to live. So you have food deserts and you have people eating fake food. And I just think about Flint, Michigan as a symptom of what's wrong. If we're waiting for the person to come to Dr. Bell, who is skillful enough to help them, but just to get them there, and if you really people listen to this talk, there wouldn't be enough Dr. Bells that would open up their door and not move them out the room in 5 minutes. So it's really, like you said earlier, Joe, it's an interdependent systemic attack on human beings. And now that I've done habits and I've done habitats, let's just deal with history. We were kidnapped and brought here as commodities, trafficked, and even when they stopped the Atlantic slave trade, they actually set up breeding farms where they made black people breed each other to create more children to satisfy their slavery agenda. So you're coming out of deep histories, habitats that have been tainted by poverty. You're looking at people 50 years and older who are disconnected, distorted, and they're using distractions, drugs, alcohol, different things to distract and numb the pain. And now you're saying, how can we help them? Well, the solution has to be personal and systemic because you don't have enough providers to deal with personal care.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Gordon, one of the things that AARP South Carolina has done is we've done the research to tie the health disparities here among the African American 50 plus population to the work that has been done for years regarding health disparities. And we know and understand that there are those that have been working on addressing health disparities for years, and that this is not a solution that we can come up with and overnight is going to be solved. This is, as you said, a systemic issue. It's going to take time to develop solutions. But this segment is intended to provide individuals with useful information and resources that can improve their health literacy, their understanding of what they can do and the resources available to help them when they are in need. And I tell you, this conversation, this time, this 30 minutes is not long enough. I want to thank you for being with us, Dr. Bell. As always, thank you for your leadership and your guidance. We will continue this conversation. There is much work to be done, and it does not end here. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Thank
Peace
you.
and blessings.